You remember, well, first of all, I got to give my same plug here. If you wanted a background study of the history of slavery, you can listen to my recording from 2 years ago. Go on my website, down to William Wilberforce, and over to down a page and hit review historical background of slavery from 2021. So you can do that. Now, you remember that when Wilberforce was converted, he wrestled long and hard to figure out what it is that the Lord would have him do. He didn't know exactly what his calling would be. He didn't know if he needed to change if he needed to abandon Parliament and go into some religious pursuit, or exactly what it was that the calling of the Lord would be. And he wrestled with this and finally sought out his childhood friend, John Newton. And John Newton, over 10 years, advised and prayed with him and counseled him and led him in applying his calling to his work in the Parliament, which would be radical, because one author said that he was probably, Wilberforce in those days was probably the only Christian in Parliament at the time, and that is in contrast to when everything is said and done, there were probably 100. So even in Parliament, things would begin to change. It's remarkable what the Lord did. You remember that Wilberforce sat down and he wrote in his diary, he says, I've got two main objects that I am going to pursue with my time and my career and my gifts. And one was the abolition of slavery, and the other was the reformation of manners. And, you know, I said that sounds a little bit silly today, but what he really meant, if we would translate that today, it would mean the transformation of culture, which is astounding to think of. And so let's back up and take a look again at the size of the objects that he has to deal with. First of all, you remember that the first explorers set out to find gold and silver in the new lands. And for all intents and purposes, they came up short. They did find a little, but it was hardly rewarding. But what they did find was the profit of commodities, the gift that keeps on giving, if you will. And remember I said that in the explorers' minds, that their pursuit for gold and silver meant it gave them permission to do whatever they wanted to the peoples that they confronted in the Americas, all in the name of the pursuit of profit. And that bloodthirsty, cruel, selfish kind of mentality carried forward when the commodities began to be discovered and realized what work effort would be needed. And so when sugar first began to be explored and expanded, and you couldn't get enough sugar into Europe, there was a need for a fast-growing need for a workforce. The first place they turned to were ones called indentured servants. When exploration was just getting started, it was literally a life and death matter. If you signed on for a trip over to the new Americas, there was no guarantee you would survive the trip. There was no guarantee you would survive being there, and it would be hard toil all the way through. And so finding people to do the work was rare, possibly with the exception of the committed Christians that landed in New England. But for the most part, what they did was they employed criminals. They employed criminals who had been arrested and were subject to being hanged or executed. And in those days, you could be executed for stealing a purse. Anything that brought you into England had no tolerance for keeping you in jail and feeding you and providing you, as they say today, 3 hots on a cot. There's no point of that. Put him, just hang him, get rid of him. And the other kind of person you might run into is people who fall into grievous, irresponsible debt. Both of these kinds of characters could sign on to travel over to the Americas as what they called indentured servants. Indentured servants would work for a period of time, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever they signed up for. And at the end of that year, of that term, the idea is that they would be given their freedom. Well, that was the promise back in England. Didn't always work out that well. Sometimes you didn't get it. Sometimes you died early. Sometimes you would get it, and you were on your own, and your destiny would start from there. And so first the idea of recruiting indentured servants. We want more indentured servants. Give us more criminals, more gambling people, more people that are in the jails, and they would be shipped over to the West Indies and to Brazil and to Central America to work, but they realized Europeans were not really cut out for this. We're too spoiled, we're too soft. They were susceptible to the diseases that they found in the Americas, and would catch them and die. Malaria was yellow fever. All of these things they found that the Europeans were just too susceptible to. And as the businesses continued to grow and these profit margins continued to rise and the demand for these products began to get right, there was no way there could be enough indentured servants to fill the need. Now, so the second option was African slaves, and African slaves offered a better situation, a better profit, a better circumstance. They were already prevalent. The slave market was already booming, thanks to the Arabs and the Muslims in the East, and so they were already easily obtained. The Africans proved to be rather sturdy health-wise. They were resistant to illnesses. And Portugal, I pointed this out last time, Portugal is located on the coast and is the one nation that's in the best position to both contact and be in contact with the European nations as well as Africa. And it was Portugal that started to invest in the trade of slaves from Africa first. But after other nations discovered that was going to work, then they all followed suit. The obtaining of slaves at first was to purchase them from the Arabs. They already had this market going, as I said, and they had already classified slaves by race and by gender. It's like, well, you sit down and you say, well, what do you want your slave to do? What kind of circumstance? What kind of climate? And have we got the slave for you? And they would organize, in those categories. So it was already a very efficient system, and the Arabs were very good at it, and it was a very good profit. But when Portugal got on to the, wait a minute, let me back up. They were African nations already caught wind of the profit that this would bring them, and so they would attack other tribes, capture them, and sell them off for the profit, and as I said, the price was already established. It was already a well-working market by the time that Europe was looking for them. But Portugal discovered that they could get them themselves. And all you had to do was go south and land on the west coast of Africa, and you could find all of the willing, cooperative blacks to do your work for you there. All you had to do was ply them with liquor, or with cotton, or with any other trades, or sugar, or all the things. Ply them with that, and they would bring them in droves. So you would get the blacks to do the work for you, and they bribed other Africans to do that, or they would say, we're going to have a party, and everybody come out to the party, and there would be food and drink and games and all kinds of things, and the next thing you know, they're all surrounded, and they're ushered right onto the boats. And so any way you could get them was legitimate. And it became quite aggressive, quite fast. But the real horror of the slave trade was known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the boat ride. And of course, you probably are very aware of this. The captives would be brought to the coast, and they would be herded onto ships. A typical ship at the beginning of the trade was a cargo vessel of 150 ton, and you could cram anywhere from 300 to 600 slaves onto such a ship. It wasn't designed to carry human cargo. You would be down in the hold, and whatever makeshift kind of arrangements could be made was what you were allowed to do. And once the cargo hold got stuffed, then they would set sail, and the trip would probably take 1 to 2 months, depending on weather. You know that if you watch the hurricane season maps, you know that a lot of the hurricanes originate as storms from West Africa and cross the Atlantic and sweep up to where we are. And so the storms were often the problem. And they would travel the southern route, because that was one of the fastest ones for currents, in order to arrive primarily in South America. But that meant that the trip itself was unbearably hot, and the conditions aboard were dreadful, to the point where it was very typical that a fourth of your cargo would die on the way. They tried everything they could to accommodate for that. They would bring the slaves up on deck every once in a while and force them to dance or get some exercise before driving them back down into the hold. The captives were fed just enough to keep them alive. It wasn't important that they did anything. They just laid there, the hold for them. They didn't have to do any work. So you fed and watered them just enough to keep them alive. And the food, of course, was yummy and just wonderful. They would be brought up, as I said, and the trip would take 1 to 2 months, depending on weather conditions. The crew was, if anybody became chronically ill or morbidly ill, it looked like they were dying, because of the advantages of the insurance company's investment, they would just toss them overboard. And that way they would get more for their passage. It was an economic thing there too. And so very often the slaves would be just thrown overboard on the midst of the trip. But one thing that's not known very well is that the crew had it just as bad, if not worse. Who wants to crew a ship of slaves? It was not a very attractive job to have. In fact, the captains had a lot of trouble getting crews to man their boats, and so they would capture men in bars and in gambling casinos and in the drunk in the alleys, and they would kidnap them, and they would put them on the boats, and they would force them to be the crew. And the crew didn't do much better than the slaves. They were allowed to abuse the slaves for their own entertainment. They would be given the women in order to keep them passive. But the death rate among the crew was higher than the death rate among the slaves. That was a very interesting statistic that I came across. Close to the end of the voyage, as soon as they came close to where they knew they would find land, all of a sudden there was food to feed the slaves. They started to feed them so they could fatten them up a little bit, and they would let them out on deck and exercise them a bit, and they would tend to their medical needs. If they had open wounds, they would patch them up. They would do whatever they could, because now they were going to, when they got on shore, they were going to be auctioned off. They were going to be sold for slaves. The young, the strong men would be sold individually, and the sickly, the women, the children would be bunched together. They would be grouped together and sold as a lot. Now I want you to notice that, because that will change later. The women were not considered to be all that profitable. They were just captured with the rest of the guys. And you had women, just like I said, entertain the men. But something is going to change in the whole enterprise of slavery that will all of a sudden make women a very valuable commodity themselves. But that's later. That's later. The question comes up, of course, in a Christian nation, even a nation that isn't Christian but calls itself Christian. Where was the moral crisis? Where were the ones who stood up and said, this is wrong, we can't do this, what are we doing? And what's the answer to that? And the answer starts by the fact that British in general didn't care and didn't want to know. They were kept in the dark, and that was just fine. And part of the reason that worked is if you look at the map on where the slaves were taken from and where they went. You see a tremendous amount of them going to South America, focus on Brazil. You see the next major group going to the West Indies and to Central America. Very few, by comparison, went to North America. Even less went to Britain. So while the sugar and the commodities and all of the products came to Britain and were filling your stores, and the prices were getting lower and lower and getting more and more attractive, nobody knew where it came from. They didn't care. They just wanted to get it on sale. Sound familiar, by the way? You know, most of our stuff comes from China. I know, it's hard to deal with. If you had time, you could study this map. The goods and services are being exchanged back and forth. This is called the triangle, the triangle route. All the slaves, however, went the southern route to the West Indies primarily, or to South America, and all of the products went north. All of the products went in other places. So even if you enjoyed the commodities, you didn't know where they came from, and as a result, it didn't make any difference to you. But when slaves began to be visible, they were treated with the same contempt in the Americas as the local peoples were, the ones we refer to as Indians. They were different. They were uneducated. They were of a different culture. There was a language barrier. There was a lack of education. The ones you saw, the slaves you saw, were being forced into demeaning positions, and you naturally just assumed that's what they do, that's who they are, that's what they're for. And it didn't take long for you to just assume a prejudiced, conditioned attitude toward them. That led to apathy as time continued to go along, and as you continued to enjoy yourself. Prosperity meant, why bother asking? This is great. I'm having everything I want. The demand for commodities and the improvements to European way of life were just too welcome to want to deny myself. I just remember Elizabeth I dying with rotten teeth in her mouth. Just can't get enough of it. Please, more. Fashions, cotton, tobacco. You saw Sir Walter Raleigh. Nobody cared what it took to get it. They just wanted it. Another reason is that the slave trade was enormously profitable for those that did know what was going on. When you get lots and lots in return, you don't want to think about what other people are suffering. You don't want to hear about it. Just take care of it. Bring me the check. And so a deep-seated selfishness rules the day here. One historian said that Liverpool slavers, just between 1783 and 1793, carried over 300,000 slaves to the West Indies, sold them for 15 million pounds in those days, and profited 30%. Well, if that's paying for my house, my mansion, my country home in the rural areas, and all of my horses that I'm proud of, I'm not going to ask questions. And there were also reasons of state. England's not just the only nation doing this, you know. France is in it now, Spain's in it now, Portugal's beaten everybody. And if we were to stop, the profits would all go to them. And then what would they do to us? So there was even a self-serving argument of self-preservation. They might get strong and attack us. We don't want that. And I found this other quotation very interesting. One excuse for keeping the slave trade going in Brazil and in the West Indies was that lest they become like those tiresome New England colonies, which developed into little democracies of white men with English notions of political freedom and lack of slaves, by the way. We don't want... Remember what King James said? You know, you can't make slaves out of thinking men. Who were the ones in New England? The Christians. The ones who really understood what was going on. What you think, the fact that you think, makes a difference. Meanwhile, you remember the culture. This is the second thing that Wilberforce was troubled by. The culture, you remember we started with this. Spent the whole hour on the gin age. The culture in London was a disaster. The gin age produced a culture of gross and open sinfulness. Nobody cared about anything. Morality was merely a social norm. In other words, what's tolerable, what's acceptable. That's very comparable to the way we are here in the United States today. They only push the envelope as long as nobody calls them on it. And nobody's calling them on it, so it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Cruelty and heartlessness dominated the personality of everyone, whether they were rich or poor. One quotation, too many men and women were hanged. Venality, drunkenness, and the high crime rate arose from the general decadence, especially the corruption and irreligion of the trendsetters, not in those days pop stars, but media moguls, but nobility and landed gentry. So in other words, we look to our Hollywood guys today to set the trends. And that means morality as well as anything else. In those days, they didn't have Hollywood, but they had the hoity-toity. They had the people with riches and wealth and the latest fashions from France, and you look to them for to set trends. And others, I think I mentioned this before, others who had tried to call Great Britain on this morally were the Wesleys and George Whitefield, but they had gone to the lower classes. Why? Because they're the ones that will listen. They're the ones who sit under their preaching. The upper classes don't bother. They hate them. Remember Wilberforce growing up, and his mother was appalled to think he might become a Methodist? The lower classes were the only ones who were hearing, but the lower classes lack power. The lower classes lack influence. And so they were not getting anywhere. But there was a rising voice of abolitionists to join Wilberforce in this. He was not alone, and that's one of the main things to remember. Wilberforce was never alone in this effort. His name comes to the surface because of what he did in Parliament, but he was not alone. Let me just give you the profile of several folks that were visionary right along with him. The Reverend James Ramsay, I mentioned him last time. He started off as a Scottish surgeon aboard a vessel that cruised down to and ministered to and treated medically slaves in the West Indies. It was his first introduction to it. He was appalled by what he saw. He just couldn't believe the conditions that the slaves were in. You remember, in these early days, you worked slaves until they died. You didn't have to house them permanently. You didn't have to take care of it. You just worked them until they died, and when they died, you went and you got somebody younger and healthier, and you put them in the field. And so it was a disposable enterprise. He treated over 100 enslaved people in filth and degradation. Later, he returned to England. He was ordained as an Anglican priest. Even evangelicals beginning to influence Anglicanism. And he chose to return back and work in the Caribbean among the enslaved people. He had an influence primarily on Captain Sir Charles Middleton, who would rise to the ranks of admiral in the wars and was serving in Parliament himself. Captain Middleton was influenced by a pamphlet written by Reverend Ramsay, and he used his influence and position to assist in the abolitionist effort as he could. And then the third person here on this slide is Prime Minister William Pitt. He was a contemporary of Wilberforce. They were actually fairly good friends. Good friends in the way that they did not treat each other politically. That would be exceptional. Wilberforce did not try to twist Pitt's arm off. Pitt didn't try to tell Wilberforce how to vote. They were friends. They respected one another. Sometimes they would be on the opposite sides, but most of the time they pulled together. And on this issue, Pitt was very much in support of what Wilberforce was going to try to do. Wilberforce reform began, as any reform must begin, with himself. He realized he was converted and saved from slavery himself, spiritual slavery. And he needed to understand who it was that he was. And he reflected, for instance, and he changed what he referred to as his Cambridge indolence. In Cambridge was his college. You know, guys always learn bad habits in college. And they come back and they think that's the lifestyle, you know. Oh, we had it great at college and I'm just going to live just like that. And he said the party life's got to go. The party life has got to go. He was popular. Nobody could throw a party like Wilberforce. Nobody could have fun like Wilberforce. And he's saying the most part of those parties have to go. If we're going to have something, if we're going to have a social occasion from now on, it has to have a reason. There has to be a purpose for it. And so he says all of this partying has to go. He began practicing abstinence, not because he was a legalist, but because he wanted to demonstrate that alcohol could have that effect of carrying him away and making him irresponsible. And he also rejected what he called the temptations of the table, not just overeating, but spending hours. Remember, they didn't have sports, so you didn't just eat wings in front of the television. You didn't have electronic entertainment. You couldn't just go over to a friend's house to play video games. You would spend hours sitting at the table talking. And Wilberforce said, I have given myself to that for a humongous amount of my life, and most of the conversation is drivel. It's worthless. It's self-enhancing. It's silly. And so the temptations of the table were not only overeating and over-drinking, but over-babbling, as I would translate that. Those things that he rejected and walked away from disqualify me for every useful purpose in life. They waste my time, impair my health, fill my mind with thoughts of resistance before and self-condemnation afterwards. So he is, faith is as faith does, right? If you believe, it's going to change your life. And that is what Wilberforce was facing. If I believe the gospel, it's got to change my life. And he began to see his calling more and more clearly as time went on. He gave himself to the study of the slave trade. He looked into it, whereas nobody else bothered. His newfound Christian morality gave him a strong initial optimism. Let's do this. We can do this. We can accomplish this. We can change culture in this way. John Wesley, on his deathbed, wrote to Wesley and said, I wish you well, dude, but it's more, if... And I like the way that Wesley put this. He says, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy, which is the scandal of religion, the scandal of England, the scandal of human nature. And unless God has raised you up for this very thing, You will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Notice what he says here. He says two things I want to point out to you. Unless God has raised you up. He says, if God is not behind this, if this is just your political venture, as weird and as unpopular as it may be, if God is not behind this, it's going to consume you. It's going to wear you out. Now, I see young people. I want you to know this. I want you to be aware of this. Wesley is only half right. Anything that you believe in, whatever religion it is, whatever you give your religious worship to, that will consume you. It will consume you. Believing, being a Christian, will consume you. But it's a question of what you're giving yourself for, what you're giving yourself to. Everything in this life takes life away from you. I want you to think about that when you make your choices. Nothing's going to leave you alone. Whatever you give yourself to will eat you alive. You want to be like Paul, being poured out as a drink offering for Christ. What you do for Christ will last. Avoid the temptations of the table and make your life count. That's where he started. That's where Wilberforce had to start. He couldn't just start by telling other people what to do. He couldn't just, condemn other people for their sinfulness. He had to start with himself. That is the real message of the Christian faith. You must start with yourself. If you've just become a Christian, that's where you need to start with. Look yourself in the mirror and say, what must I do to change in response to what Christ has done for me? And do that before you bother waylaying other people about their sinfulness. Another group that became very, very critical and important to Wilberforce regarding the second goal of changing culture was a group that came to be known as the Clapham Circle. It was a group of friends who all had the shared commitment of dealing with the slave trade, but also of changing the culture of England. It was just despicable, and they hated it. And these friends all decided they were going to physically locate close to each other in London. We're actually going to live in the same general area. We're going to support one another. We're going to encourage one another. We're going to eat together. We're going to share ideas. We're going to strategize. We're going to decide how it is we're going to do this, and we're going to make something happen. And so we're called the Clapham Circle. Sometimes they're called the sect, but it doesn't mean that they had strange beliefs. Or they called the Clapham Saints even. So they built this community, and they formed this little Christian, I use the term political action committee. I'm not sure if that's proper or not, but they wanted to influence the culture, and in order to do that, you have to work together to do it. They pooled their resources, their contacts, their knowledge, and they pushed for nonconformist causes. And their strategy, this is important, the strategy they decided to take was not to go after the big things at once. We're not going to try to tackle everything at once. We're going to try to nibble away at it. Now, I've followed the pro-life movement for 40 years. And I remember the days of Randall Terry, and other protesters who went with the idea, we're going to knock this baby down all at once. And it failed. And now, the strategy of the pro-life movement is to whittle away at it little by little by little. They've borrowed from Wilberforce's strategy. And that's exactly what Wilberforce and the rest of them decided to do. They would take on little bits of it at a time and continue to make progress one step at a time. They would focus also on the upper classes because that's where the power was. They wanted to speak to power. They wanted to make change that would trickle down. Let me give you just a quick profile of some of these guys in the Clapham Circle. The first one was Henry Thornton. It was Henry Thornton that came up with the idea of the community. So he had a house built, and they all could stay there from time to time, and they met in the library, and so it was Thornton that provided the residence. He was a financial and business expert. His faith gave him a very liberal generosity. He gave generously to all of the efforts that they came up with. He came up with an early idea regarding reestablishing a colony of free slaves back in West Africa. He was one of the first ones to say, let's take them back. Let's send them back home. And it was called the Sierra Leone project. Another one was Granville Sharp. He was not upper class. This was a pull himself up by the bootstraps kind of guy. Not highly educated. He taught himself. He was motivated and driven to teach himself law, and he defended individual cases of slaves versus slave owners in court, and he won. And he became very proficient in that. He's also one that helped to win Wilberforce to their circle. Another one was John Venn, rector of the parish church in Clapham. He was the spiritual advisor to the church. Every time there might be a question, what do we do in this regard? And he was there for that. And he had contacts in the Anglican Church. He had organized visitation schedules, confirmation classes, formed the Society for the Bettering of the Conditions of the Poor. He was an organizer, and he put his gifts to work. A fourth one was Hannah More. Hannah More, girls, is a remarkable study. Remember her name, get a book about her, and read it. She's amazing. And she was a successful poet and playwright. She wrote Thoughts on the Manners of the Great. And again, we're talking about culture of the great. In other words, it's like the heroes of Christian culture. That's kind of where she's coming from. It was a bestseller. People were attracted to this stuff. They read it. It began moving in their hearts and minds. Inspiring reading is vital. It's important. Like I said last time, read something. She focused with Wilberforce on the lower classes in some areas. She organized the first Sunday schools. You always hear about what's the history of Sunday schools. Well, she was right in there with the midst of that. Wasn't the Sunday schools we're used to today. It was the only education that kids could get when they worked in factories 6 days a week, 16 hours a day. And she organized religious and popular schools for 500 children within an area of 75 square miles. So she was remarkable. She was very, very efficient. The last one I'll point out is Zachary Macaulay. He was previously an estate manager within the West Indies, and he was the one-man research department. If you needed facts, you needed figures, he could come up with it. He knew where to go, he knew who to talk to. He gathered facts and sifted evidences, he digested parliamentary papers, provided powerful political analysis. He was very, very helpful in that. First editor to the Christian Observer. Has anybody ever heard of the Christian Observer? It's still around, I think. And its influence was to speak to London in the 19th century. Others in the Clapham Circle included Thomas Clarkson, James Stevens, Charles Grant, John Shore. One historian said, the Clapham sect pioneered techniques of mobilizing public opinion that have become commonplace in democracies today. They exploited the media outlets, the newspapers, the flatboards, the lectures, the billboards, the newspapers, the pamphlets. They made effective use of voluntary societies and unprecedented use of petitions to exert public pressure on Parliament. Petitions, the whole idea of signing a petition and presenting it to a member of Parliament. This is how many people in your district that want this. That's awakening. That stirs the typical member of Parliament out of his drunken, selfish stupor and says, oh, if I'm going to get elected, maybe I better do something about this. So the first thing that Wilberforce did was to go after the manners goal. It was second in his list, but he realized he needed to do both of these at the same time. And the first thing he did was we went after the manners. And how am I going to do that? Well, ever since William and Mary, there had been a tradition in England. Every time there was a new king or queen, they would issue the first proclamation. And the first proclamation became a tradition after William and Mary. Their first proclamation was called the encouragement of piety and virtue and the preventing of vice, profaneness, and immorality. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? For William and Mary, it was profound. It changed culture in their day. It was a call from the king to change your way of living. But as a tradition, every king ever since always issued the same first proclamation, didn't give a whit about it. King George III was the very same. When he came to the throne, he issued that first proclamation to show off, to make people feel like I'm a great king and all that sort of stuff. Didn't mean anything. Everybody slept through it. By now, it didn't change England at all. Wilberforce had an idea. He said, let me see if I can talk King George into giving that first proclamation again. Now, this was many years after he became king. It wouldn't be the first proclamation, but he could give it again. And Wilberforce talked King George into doing it. And so he issued that proclamation again. The encouragement of piety and virtue, and for the preventing of vice, profaneness, and immorality. Well, if the king says it, now Wilberforce has something to work with. And he did that by reaching out. As soon as the proclamation was made, he reached out to bishops, and he reached out to dukes and others in power and influence, and he began to talk to them about what they could do to implement the king's proclamation. And he was inviting the trendsetters to have a social conscience. Let's do something positive. Doesn't have to be much, but let's start by doing something positive in answer to the king's proclamation. He's giving us this twice. He wants us to pay attention. You can just hear him arguing it, can't you? And he said, well, what do you got in mind, Wilberforce? Well, let's we start small. Let's just make some small changes. But because you're behind it, it might become popular. And so a duke would make a proclamation saying, I'm in favor of the king's proclamation and we're going to do this. And everybody would say, oh, that must be the thing to do. And slowly but surely, the goal Wilberforce had was, as he put it, make goodness fashionable. It's an interesting way to put it, isn't it? Make goodness fashionable. We're going to be polite. We're going to regard others. We're going to apply the golden rule. We're not going to trash other people. Boy, could we learn this today or what? Think we get Biden to issue a first proclamation? No, I don't want to hear about it. The interesting thing about this, and historians debate, Christian historians debate, on whether or not this was Wilberforce really compromising too far or doing the smart thing. Because his efforts at changing culture did not smack of Christianity. They did not even dictate right from wrong. He just wanted to make it fashionable. He just wanted to change the attitude that people had. Now, we can all have our opinions about that, and we can talk about it, but for the period of time that was starting under Wilberforce's influence, change was being made. Wilberforce was part of that Clapham circle, and his gift, his addition, his contribution was being the point of the spear to Parliament. He said, you guys have this, you all have our strengths. My job is to try to influence Parliament. And so he decided, this is how I'm going to achieve the first of those goals. We're going to get Parliament to abolish slavery. In 1787, in an effort to influence Parliament, he lined up with Josiah Wedgwood. Yes, this is Wedgwood of Wedgwood Poverty. Anybody got any Wedgwood pottery? Very, very, very famous. He came up with this emblem and put it on a medallion, and that became the symbol of the abolition movement. You know, everybody's got a little medallion now, and his little advertisements. I mean, he played some smart games here. In 1789, while he was still dealing with a physical ailment, his health had already begun to give him real problems. When he was recovering from one of his bouts of ill health, remember the last time he went to the French Riviera, he introduced his very first motion to Parliament concerning the slave trade. It included 12 different proposals, 12 different things that could be done, 12 different steps that could be, that he provided by way of argument. He had studied the state and the condition of the slaves. He gave speeches on the floor of Parliament saying, I have been there, I have done this, I have seen what I'm talking about. He had examined the harm that the slave trade was doing to the continent of Africa. He was pointing out all the negatives to the slave trade in every one of the areas it touched. And he was thorough, he was exhaustive in his efforts. He exposed himself to the horrors of the Middle Passage. He told the stories about all of the ships that had done this. Some of them had faced rebellion. Others it was the horror stories that were going on. But by the time it was all done, all he was asking for was a limit to the number of slaves on any given ship. Can we just limit the number? And Parliament flushed it down the toilet. No way. Sorry. Not interested. When news got out that Wilberforce was after this, and Wilberforce was, you remember, a gifted speaker, influential in his own right as a politician. And so as soon as he decided he was going to have an unpopular stand, of course the criticism coming to him was terrible. And he began to be dismissed and raked across the coals. Planters, businessmen, ship owners, traditionalists, even the Crown opposed the idea of abolition. Many were afraid that if this caught wind, it would be the financial ruin not only of their businesses but of all of England. He was vilified. I don't know if you've ever heard of Admiral Horatio Nelson. Not only one of the champion admirals on the sea of England, but perhaps one of the finest admirals ever to sail the seas for anybody, anywhere. He really attacked Wilberforce, castigating the damnable doctrine of Wilberforce and his hypocritical allies. Don't know where he was coming from, except maybe just social balance. One of Wilberforce's friends wrote, fearing he would one day read of Wilberforce being carbonadoed. Ever heard of that? Broiled by Western Indian planters and barbecued by Guinea captains. And at one point in his life, he was even challenged to a duel. And I'll let you read and figure out how that turned out. So, immediately his name was Mud. And he had to always be about the business of defending himself. But he kept trying. He kept bringing bills back to Parliament, and they kept getting turned down. There were more and more reasons to reject it. It wasn't just simply because we don't like this, we want to keep it. There were other things that brought political concern into the minds and hearts of the parliamentarians. In 1791, he presented a proposal, but it was at the same time they had heard of an uprising in Santo Domingo. Slaves had revolted against their owners, and there was ugliness and battle, and the put down was terrible. Parliament said, what are we letting slaves free for if they're just going to turn around and attack us? And so they turned it down then. They had reasons now. Logical, reasonable reasons. Wilberforce, use your, this makes sense. We have to keep this institution going, because otherwise our whole civilization is just going to go up in smoke. In 1789, he was afraid to introduce such legislation into Parliament, because Parliament was preoccupied watching France go through the horrors of their Revolutionary War. Over the period of time of 10 years, they sent 10,000 to the guillotine. Chaos reigned at their very edge, at their very shore. And we're not changing anything. We're not doing anything that might disrupt our economy and our social order. No, forget it. We're not doing anything. So Wilberforce let that period pass. He didn't have a choice. With regard to the abolition movement, he worked elsewhere, but right there he didn't have much choice. But when that was over, further defeats came actually during it. In 1792, 1793, 1797, again and again, he was sent back to the drawing board. Nothing would work. Nothing was allowed. Meanwhile, the enthusiasm for the social reform began to pick up. He was beginning to see influence in the upper classes. Their attitudes were changing about what they wanted England to be, about what they wanted each other to be. Laws restricting drinking and swearing and gaming on Sundays began to be enforced. They were there already, but they began. I said, we're gonna start enforcing the laws again. Great idea, don't you think? Enforcing the laws that are already on the books. All loose and licentious prints, books, and publications began to be suppressed. Oh dear, think of the pushback that would cause. Got to have my porn. Well, we're not allowing that anymore. Well, that's freedom of speech. You can't do that. Yes, we can. And they wanted to. They wanted to do it. As one historian said, the Reformation of manners grew into the Victorian virtues that you see in the next century. And Wilberforce managed to touch the world. Managed to touch the world. One man. He was nicknamed, because of his manners focus, he was nicknamed probably by his enemies the Prime Minister of Philanthropy, because he was so incredibly generous with his money. He would eventually be active in no less than 69 philanthropic endeavors and ventures. 69 efforts to better his fellow man. In this direction, in that area, in this department, everywhere he could think of, he put his own money to work. He gave away, ultimately, a fourth of his inheritance and his income. You remember, he received his inheritance from his grandfather's shipping business, and his dad was a merchant, and most of that he lived on, the investment of which he lived on the rest of his life. He managed to give away a fourth of it by the time his days were over. He supported Charles Wesley's widow for 20 years after Charles Wesley died. He sought the welfare of soldiers, of sailors, of animals, the first one to create the, what do they call it, SPCA? Established Sunday schools and orphanages not for the sweet little people we've got, but for the criminal poor people, children, the ones who steal on the streets and the ones who are not claimed by any adult, and the ones who, when they get to 10, 12 years old, begin to prostitute themselves. And he made a point of bringing in those children. Wilberforce always struggled with his health. This is the famous painting of Wilberforce. It hangs in London now. You get a mistaken impression of that pose right off the bat. You think he might be a little effeminate. He's not. But notice the size of the chair. He's a little man, 5 foot maybe. He has spine issues, but his neck hurts. By the time he's an old man, he can't hold it up anymore, and so he walks around with his head in his chest. He has colitis. His eyes are going bad, but he keeps going. He keeps going. When he has to take a break for physical recuperation, he does so. More than once, the doctors would look at him on bed and say, "You don't have 2 weeks." And he would remarkably recover, enough to keep going, enough to move on. In 1797, he met a sweet young thing named Barbara Spooner. It was the love of his life. People always wondered, I don't think Wilberforce is ever going to marry. But he found Barbara Spooner and he married her, and she was the delight of his life, which was a good thing because no one else could stand her. They had 6 kids together, and because of his Christian commitment, he was a devoted father. And he gave attention to them in ways that fathers were not used to doing in those days. And he devoted himself to them. He had devotions with them. They would eat together. It was an amazing house. And Wilberforce led the way there. Again, he started with himself. He started with his own family. More defeats came through the political infighting in 1804, 1805. He keeps manipulating things in the power circles, the back halls, making eloquent speeches in Parliament, getting nowhere, manipulating this bill, trying to get this bill passed. They're blocking him at every turn. Meanwhile, his Manners goal, it continues to flower and boom. In 1804, he assists in the creation of the British and Foreign Bible Society. That's still going. In the Church Missionary Society, which was one of the first organized missionary endeavors. Now that would have been distinctively Christian. So these two things both would have had a Christian emphasis. So it's not like he's setting it aside or putting his Christian faith in the back closet, but he's got room for it all, and he works the room, if you will. Finally, 1807, the climate in England has changed. The economic situation has changed, slowly but surely. In 1807, only because of some backdoor political maneuvering that made the opportunity to put this in right now, let's do it, almost before people could think about what they were voting for, and they voted to pass it. The abolition of slave trafficking had stopped. Parliament rose to applause, and Wilberforce sat there weeping. Wilberforce instantly became both a national hero and a villain at the same time because of what this was going to mean to those businesses that lost that trade. The trade, of course, was the shipping industry. That was the trade. The collectors on the West Coast who would capture slaves and put them on the boats, the ship captains and their investors who paid for the boats and paid to have them sail across the Atlantic, and the ones on the other end who would receive the slaves and the auction houses and put the slaves up for auction. All of that trade has now stopped. As a result of the fact that he was not only a national hero but also a national villain, there was a concerted effort to kick him out of Parliament. A lot of money exchanged hands to do this. It was political brinksmanship, and it was just such a disaster. But Wilberforce managed to hold on and got reelected by the skin of his teeth because he still has work to do. The extremely profitable business of trafficking and slavery had been successfully curbed, but slavery itself has not yet been abolished. Okay, we can't ship more slaves over the Atlantic unless we do it black market, unless we do it behind the scenes. But boy, think of all the millions of slaves that are already over there. The story is not over. There is still a lot of work to be done. And we'll leave it there for next week. Okay, any questions? Yes, sir.
So they only stopped the slave trade from England, right? Did how many countries followed suit like right after, or were they the
Well, you're getting into next week. I'll say this much. France and Portugal and Spain took advantage of it right off the bat, and they managed to keep some of it going for a while. But because England was the major provider of the ships and of the investments, their efforts would be handicapped. Yes, Martha?
I was thinking, today we have a fairly progressive movements, kind of like towards trying to what I could call finish the job, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And,
You have a long way to go.
Because people like Wilberforce, who were white and who came from a background that was changed because of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think he said he reinforced the fact that God before you be against you. And I think that's where the whole thing lies.
Yes, you're right. Lisa?
You said something about his wife.
Yes?
People didn't like her?
No, she didn't have a very good personality.
She was very opinionated.
I won't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Anybody else?